Nieco więcej powie Państwu teraz profesor Jerome Bickenbach, współtwórca klasyfikacji ICF, kierownik Działu do spraw polityki społecznej dotyczącej osób niepełnosprawnych Szwajcarskiego Ośrodka Badań nad Porażeniem Dwukończynowym. Bardzo proszę. Professor, it's your turn now and the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you very much for staying here, I guess I should say, to hear this lecture. I know it's tempting to go have a swim, perhaps, but instead of listening to me. I want to talk about something that's very exciting to me, and that is something which involves a very fundamental shift in our understanding of what disability is. All of us in this room, in one way or another, are concerned about how to determine the extent of a person's ability to function, either in a work context or some other context, or with responding to personal injury. And I want to give you an introduction to a document, a tool, an international standard developed by the World Health Organization in the late 90s and released in 2001. Called the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health. Now, what in 20 minutes, or 18 minutes and 54 seconds, what I want to do is give you a very brief introduction to, if you like, the vision of this document, because although it's an epidemiological tool by its construction, which WHO devised in order to collect internationally comparable information about the consequences of health conditions, it actually embodies a conception of disability that is fundamentally different from the conception which is predominantly used for disability assessment and evaluation and the calculation of losses for personal injuries around the world. But the fundamental difference is what I want to persuade you of and explain. This is the document. It is available online, and it is what we call a classification of the lived experience of health. It embodies a universal approach to disability. What this means, I want to explain to you in the next couple of minutes. There are two features of ICF. One is, if you like, a conceptual model of what disability is. And the other one is the epidemiological tool, a classification system. I'm not going to speak at all about the technicalities of the classification system. That is actually the system that, once embodied in an evaluation matrix or a assessment procedure, would actually be doing the work. But I don't have time in any way to go through the details of that, except to say one thing. There is only one in the world. This is it. There is one universal classification of functioning and disability, and the World Health Organization has the authorship of this. There are no competitors that have the same level of international comparability. So just as a standard tool, if you're not using this or if you're not able to link to it, then you're a data island. You're left alone, unable to compare data between different users of disability assessment, different countries, and the rest of it. So that alone is a fundamental point to keep in mind. But I want to talk about the paradigm shift. The shift in our understanding and the core vision, the core insight that ICF embodies. Like all important insights, it's absolutely simple. And the best way, I think, of explaining it is to quote from one of the first physiotherapists involved in returning people to work who actually had the presence of mind to write about it. This is after World War I, and a gentleman by the name of F. Fonescu Fox, an Englishman, was charged. He was a physiatrist, as they called him in those days, a physiotherapist, as we would call them. He was charged with bringing soldiers back to work in England after the war. some with missing limbs, some other kinds of war-related injuries. And this quote, which I dug up in an obscure book many, many years ago, is actually at the heart of the ICF. It is actually the essence of the ICF. He said, "We do not know what disability a war injury causes until we know the veteran's trade or employment." Let me just pause on this. We understand intuitively disability to be a feature of a person's body. There is a problem in a person's body: injury, disease, aging. That is completely wrong. That is a misunderstanding of what disability constitutes. This gentleman understood it because he understood that two people with precisely the same problems in their body can have entirely different disabilities. When I teach this, when I used to teach before my retirement, years and years ago, I used to say, imagine I was cooking one day in my Cuisinart, I slipped and I lost that segment of my finger. It got eaten up by my Cuisinart. Now the question is, do I have an injury? Yes. Do I have an impairment? Fine, easily calculated. Missing this, whatever that's called, I'm not a doctor, that bit of my finger. Do I have a disability? It depends. It depends. Because if I'm a concert pianist, I have a disability. I can't do my job. If I teach disability, I have a built-in example. And in fact, it facilitates my job. Now, of course, not having that bit of your finger causes other problems, typing and stuff. But the fundamental point is, and the essence of ICF, you don't understand a disability until you understand the environment. Disability exists in the interaction between things that are happening in my body, like missing fingers, like diabetes, like respiratory illness, like chondromalacia patella in my knee from running, the things that happen in my body in interaction with the demands that my environment makes. That's where disability is. It's not in my body. It's in the interaction between me and the world. That's ICF. Let me explore that insight a bit more by giving you the 4 guiding principles of the development of the ICF. I was hired in 1993 to help in the revision of what at the time was called the International Classification of Impairments, Disabilities, and Handicaps, the ICIDH, which was released in 1975 and for field testing in 1980. These principles constitute the conceptual heart of the ICF and why it is fundamentally different from any other classification. Universality. First of all, disability is not something that happens to a special group of people. It is a fundamental condition of the human fate. Everyone, if they're not lucky enough to live long enough, will have a disability. Everyone in this room has a disability. And when I really want to make people, especially gerontologists, upset, I say aging is a process of acquiring disabilities. It's not becoming wiser and wiser or having your children love you more. Actually, it's becoming more disabled because the aging process lessens your functional capacity in as many domains as there are in the human body. So that means that disability isn't some special trait of a minority group. It's what makes us human. In some very fundamental way, disability is the defining feature of the human condition. We are vulnerable, we break, we get illnesses, we fall apart, we have pain. I hope I'm not ruining your day by saying it, but we die as well. And that is what it means to be a human being. So disability isn't some strange trait that some people have. It is what makes us human. As I mentioned from Dr. Fox, disability properly constructed is an interactive phenomena. It is rooted in the human body because it has to have a biomedical substrate, if you like. It has to have a feature in the body that is not functionally optimal, whatever that is. And we can play around with what normality is or not, but it's fairly clear that there are thresholds for every function in the human body: respiration, muscle strength, range of motion, any function that you identify, that there is a continuum from optimal or okay to non-existent. Disability is the interaction between whatever level of decrement you have in a functional domain and what you need to do with it. How much demands the environment make, or let's keep it concrete, what the job requirements are. Work capacity, the notion that many of us work with for disability assessment, is a function of what the workplace requires and what the person can achieve. I will end this lecture with a diagram to show you how ICF actually plays itself out in that context. But one thing to keep in mind, what the workplace requires is not only those physical and mental and cognitive and emotional requirements of the job description, but also how many steps a person has to walk, how high the desk is, whether the office is on the first floor or on the ground floor, what people around the individual coworkers, how they perceive, and that's the environment, everything. And disability is a consequence of the interaction of the person's health state and that environment. Disability is not a dichotomous phenomena, it is a continuous phenomena. Now this creates measurement issues. And if you're looking at disability assessment, and if you're an epidemiologist as I am, you immediately look at non-dichotomous phenomena differently than continuous phenomena. I don't want to go into the details, but it makes it possible for me to say everyone is disabled, because there is no given threshold below which a person has an impairment, above which they don't. There is nothing given in nature. We, human beings, for purposes of our own, for the reasons that we have for shaping disability policy, set the threshold, sometimes correctly, sometimes insanely, but we do that process because the phenomena that we're measuring doesn't come written on its face a dichotomy between you have it or you don't. In disability assessment, especially in survey methodology, we identify disability in terms of its severity, but severity is a continuous function. It's not a dichotomous function, very straightforwardly. Now, the consequence of this is that when we're doing disability assessment, a decision has to be made about where the threshold of problem begins. And I want to inform you that science has some input into that decision through population norms and various other phenomena, but ultimately it's a political decision. Disability is created out of a political decision. The last phenomena has an interesting name called etiological neutrality, and breaking this down, it essentially says that someone who is trained in medicine has almost no training in disability, almost none. The only ability that they have to identify disability is the ability which you and I, without any medical training, would have. Because disability is not a medical phenomenon. Disability has to do with the lived experience of health, not its etiology, not the fact that a person has diabetes, COPD, respiratory ailments, or whatever, but because the person's body, in interaction to the environment, makes the person limited in the things that that person wants to do, or the things that are expected of that individual. That's where disability is. And a physician, someone who is an expert in biomedicine, has no more insight into that than an accountant or a lawyer like me. Actually, the only profession that has that insight is occupational therapy. Because in fact, the profession of occupational therapy, physiotherapy, social work to some extent, understands that what they're investigating is the phenomena of living with an experience, not its biomedical roots. And what I want to convince you, it's embodied in the ICF, the valid conception of disability is a conception of what it means to live with a disability. Okay, those four principles constitute, if you like, the conceptual background of the ICF. And this is its famous diagram, which, if you like diagrams, I never really like them, but of course, if you're doing a classification, you have to have a Linnaean structure, as we call it, and this parcels out the various forms. We have three dimensions: body functions and structures. And when you have problems in a body function, we call it an impairment. There are basic activities, walking, sitting, those kinds of things, which are sometimes called functional capacities. And if you have problems in those, we call them limitations. And finally, when you are involved in activities, complex, socially constructed activities like working, having a family, going to church and education, then we call those participation restrictions. Although there are arrows connecting everything, those arrows are not causation. They are statistical correlation. If there was a causation, you would need data to show it. And that's very important because, remember, this picture is etiologically neutral. There is no causal claim being made. But the bottom is where we have the important things. On top, we have some generating health state, a health condition, an injury, a disease, aging, pregnancy as well. Some generating health condition. On the bottom, we have the environment. Now, the environmental factors are everything that construct the context of the person's world. And I mean everything, from the number of steps that make it difficult for me to walk up, to laws, social constructions, culture, language, the entire context in which a person lives. Okay, now, enough theory. I want to talk just for the next 57 seconds. You don't mind if I go past the 20 because, okay, thank you. Because I just want to finish it up with some application. We're in a context in which I'm asking you to think about the use of ICF for disability assessment, and I just want to say that we, in an activity that the World Bank and WHO have created, I have just finished a report which will be released by the WHO on their website on just this point, how to use ICF for disability assessment, which contained, it's a long description of existing processes and certainly more than I can talk about here. But disability assessment is both in the social, public context and in the private context of fundamental activity. And there are only 3 ways to do it. Around the world, if you do a survey, there are only 3 ways. One, the most popular, the oldest, and the most completely scientifically bogus is called the baremic approach. In the United States, the most dominant instrument is the American Medical Association Guidelines for the Evaluation of Permanent Impairment. It arises on, I think it's most appropriately called what we call it in my home country, Canada, namely the meat chart. Because the baremic system says if you lose a finger, that's 10% disability. If you lose a hand, that's 15%. If you lose an arm, et cetera, et cetera. The point of this approach is that you infer from just biology disability. In other words, you completely ignore the environment. Because of that, you're making a fundamental mistake. The percentages that you create, you might as well make up because they bear no relationship. There is no evidence behind them. They're completely fictitious. They're based typically in the AMA guidelines and other guidelines. They're based on expert consultancies. And you have 25 doctors around a room and someone says diabetes. Oh, diabetes, that's going to give you 45% disability. And you might as well just flip a coin because those numbers mean nothing. They have no scientific validity whatsoever. They are guesses based on 1/2 of a phenomena, the body impairment, the disease. Disability is not in the body. It is a function of the body in interaction with the world. So if you made an inference from the body alone, ignoring the environment, you make the most fundamental error possible because you don't know what demands the environment puts on the individual, so you could not possibly identify what proportion or percentage of disability a person has. Everyone knows this. The scientific literature is absolutely clear. You don't have to go far to find critics of this. It's the way it's done all over the world. It is the most popular way of doing it. It's done in this country. It's done in all the countries that I've been in the past 5 months of traveling around, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Iceland, Canada. It is the most fundamental way of doing it for basically one reason. It's certain. That is to say, you look on a chart, one missing arm, percentage disability 45, no argument. Goes to court, the judge who knows nothing about this says 45%, that's what it says here in this table. Okay, fantastic, we got a number. When we have a number, we're clear, we're concerned, we're certain. It's the only virtue of the system. As I say, you could flip a coin and be more accurate. Well, perhaps not more accurate. Statistically, it would be slightly less accurate. But it'd be faster anyway. In many countries of the world, the United States, France, Germany, certainly Switzerland, the country I live, a functional capacity assessment is the step up from it. What functional capacity assessment does is look at that middle ground called activity limitation and identifies some standard things that everyone needs to do for every activity. Memory, little cognition typically thrown in, climbing stairs, sitting, standing, transferring, so the basic activities. And tosses that into the equation. Now, because of that, the reliability is infinitely better than the baremic approach, but it also ignores the environment. So, long story short, there is a way to do disability assessment properly, and that is to assess what disability actually is. And I call it the true disability assessment, and that is made possible by the ICF. Okay, last two slides. Why would we be persuaded? Why do I go to countries and try to persuade them to shift from some very familiar meat chart that gives them a percentage that everyone can say, look at, we're now at 45.3%. Isn't that scientific? When there is nothing, and I swear to you, I've done this for 20 years, there is no inherent validity in that number. The number might as well be invented for the purposes that you want it to be invented for. But it's predictable. And for a court, predictability, certainty is really more important than validity. It's a point which non-lawyers would never be able to appreciate, but as a lawyer, I can assure you, if it's certain, that's more important than it being correct, because you can predict outcomes of trials, outcomes of assessment. But the problem is it doesn't serve the interests of the people involved. In the end of the day, people who do want to go back to work need to have an assessment that reflects what they need. Now, there are two reasons for using ICF really quickly. One, it is the international standard, so everyone will be speaking the same language, which is vitally important for multidisciplinary assessments, which is more and more common around the world. Having a committee of doctor, social worker, physiotherapist, speech and language person involved, and come up with an assessment. If you speak the same language, use the same coding system, then you have the possibility of having data comparability. The other is that ICF takes the environment into account. It is part of the model. You cannot assess using ICF without having a layer of what does the job require, if you're doing work assessment. And also it has a nice feature too, which you rarely see in any other disability assessment, but what is particularly important for insurance and for return to work policy, you get a picture, you have a complete profile, not just the things that a person cannot do, but also the things that they can do. And if you ask any physiotherapist who is trying to improve the level of capacity in some work area, if there are other functions in the body, I work in a spinal cord research center. So people with tetraplegia and paraplegia, one of the first things the physiotherapists will do is look at upper arm strength and range of motion, because these individuals who used to be walking are now in wheelchairs. So if there is an upper arm issue of strength that can be built on, that is a very important piece of information for rehabilitation, because sure, they have no lower body sensation and they're paralyzed from the waist down, but they need things as well in order to return to work, in order to regain their life. So having an assessment scheme that completes the picture is very, very important. Let me show you how this works in my last example. Now, it's a really tacky diagram because I did it and I'm terrible at this. But imagine you have the red line indicates what we call the rehab trajectory. An individual is working and they're working at more capacity than they need for the job. What the job requires of them is that level of capacity. They need in order to perform the job, they need to be able to do that level of capacity. And before they had an injury on the workplace, they had that, but the injury caused that capacity level to plummet. Okay, so there's nothing magical about this. It's just over time, what you're hoping to do through rehabilitation is make the level of capacity through whatever rehabilitation, whatever you use, bring it back up to the point where the person's level of capacity matches the demands of the employment. Okay, nothing terribly phenomenal about that. But there's another line that's rarely put into effect, but it's the line that ICF insists on. And that is, well, why do you have to bring the person up to the level of capacity of the job? Why don't you bring the job down to the level of the capacity? Why don't you change the job? Why don't you adapt the workplace? Why don't you give a person assistive technology? Why don't you, if you have to, suppose this is depression we're talking about, train the coworkers to accept a person's depression? Why don't you just change the environment? I mean, remember, ICF says disability is an interaction between the environment and the person. So that gives you two sets of determinants. You don't have one, you have two now. You can either alter the person or change the world. Now, typically, standardly, changing the world is more expensive, but not always. Not always. Increasingly, as we approach legal restrictions on accessibility, workplace accommodation, and the society becomes more accessible, the cost of changing the world, or in the microcosm, changing the workplace, is feasible. And if you can get a person back to work, why don't you just bring them up to the level of what the workplace requires of them after adaptation? Why ever would you want to do that? Because it's cheaper. It's cheaper to do that. The distance, the range between what the person needs with a non-adapted environment and what they need with an adaptive environment is what I'm calling here the range of environmental modification. And we now are getting data that shows that the cost, I don't have a pointer here, the cost of moving past that dot where it intersects with workplace adaptation, higher up, that slope is higher. So the cost of that rehab is incrementally higher than it was early on. Makes perfect sense. After an injury, the first rehab costs, you have lots of improvement for modest expenditure. But if you're demanding that the rehab improvement go right up to where it was before injury, that is much more expensive. And we have data on this. So what I'm saying ICF tells you is all of a sudden in your assessment, you've opened up an entire half of the picture that you didn't have before. You can ask yourselves as insurers or as governments trying to get people to return to work, why don't we change the environment in a cost-effective way rather than forcing people, especially when it turns out to be impossible through rehabilitation to do so, to make it back to normalcy? With chronic conditions, with aging, increasingly, the epidemiology of health conditions increasingly is toward a chronic non-infectious condition, which means that your slope, your trajectory, will never be able to go back with any kind of improvement to yourself. Medication, rehabilitation, any change in your body will simply not be able to recoup the difference, but changing the world will. And as our society responds to aging demographics, the increase in injuries and the rest of it, this is not something that's optional. Governments around the world are realizing it's the only way to deal with the rising expense of disability pensions, permanent long-term care, and other kinds of social policies that essentially said, well, this person, well, we can't do anything. Let's give them money and hope they go away. Places like Netherlands are changing that by saying, get as many people back to work as possible. And the only way you can do that, my friends, is to change the world. And on that very apocryphal note, I will thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Bickenbach.